Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I'm going to be painting 4 different Christmas cards using watercolor and watercolor paper. So let's jump into it. So here is a close-up of my palette. I've got quinacridone red, cadmium red, gamboge, cadmium yellow, light. I've got sap green, phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, violet, burnt sienna, and Payne's gray. And all of the products I'm using and more info about them is in the description box. I've got 3 watercolor brushes, I've got tape, a white gel pen, pencils, and an eraser. So the paper I'm using is Canson XL watercolor paper in the 9 by 12 size. The size is actually important on this one because when you cut it in half long ways and fold it over, it makes it fit a standard card envelope. So I cut my paper along the length halfway. So they are like 4.5 inches across, or their width, and then folded up, they are 6 inches. Then I folded each of those cards in half and then put them to the side. I grabbed 2 cards and I taped them folded onto my board to kind of keep the paper from warping too much. And now I am tracing 2 circles with the masking tape. You don't have to use the masking tape as a circle guide, but I don't like drawing perfect circles. I don't even know if I can. So this is a way for me to get a perfectly round circle. Now I'm starting the sketching for the snowman, and I purposely made these pictures really easy drawing for you because I know drawing can be really intimidating when you're started. So I just basically made 3 blobs and I started with the bottom one that was bigger and then made the ones get consecutively smaller. I did kind of a rounded, melted triangular shape for the little beanie that the snowman's going to be wearing, and now I'm just sketching in a brim. A lot of these things don't have to be perfectly sketched. Some of it we can fix in the painting process. I'm mostly just using this as a guide, basically sketching out where the nose is going to be and the eyes, and now I'm starting to sketch in his scarf because we don't want our snowman to get cold. That's just mean. So I blocked in the scarf, and I didn't like the angle that I drew the scarf at. It blocks a lot of the nose. So you'll see in a second I'll erase kind of the angle that the fold of the scarf is at, just so that it can fit his face and it looks more like it's flopped over. So I'm just doing curved lines to make it look like it's more rounded. I just roughly sketched it in. I'm not even going to worry about the arms, the sticks for his arms or anything like that. Next up, I am sketching the forest scene. So I drew my moon, and I'm going to have some lines to indicate where the trees are going to be. I'm having the tallest tree be in the center. Usually don't have the focal point be in the center, but for this one I am. And then I'm having them get a little bit smaller and kind of taper off as they get to the edges of the circle. I didn't do a lot of detail on the tree one because that one mostly happens in the painting process. But I wanted to have a guide so I knew where to keep the moonlight and where the sky was going to meet the trees. So now I'm prepping my colors for the background of our snowman. And I will say this, I did not get very good footage of me mixing colors for this video. I had to zoom in so much so that you guys could see what I'm drawing because these are such tiny pictures that it cut out a lot of the mixing palette. So I'll do my best to explain what I am mixing. But I started off by wetting the sky area or the background behind our snowman, and I'm just being really, really careful about how I'm going around the edge because I don't want the water to go over the edge of that line we drew because then the paint will spread there because the paint will go wherever you've wet the paper. So now I am adding the ultramarine blue into the background to create kind of the base color we're going to be working from. And one thing to keep in mind, since we're working wet into wet, these paints are going to dry even lighter than what they look like. Watercolor typically does that, but when you're working on a really wet paper, I notice it dries even more lighter than if you just used paint on dry paper. But I've dabbed in some violets and some of the Payne's gray, and now I'm doing some more blue, and I'm just building up the layers and really starting to get this saturated. And I'm being really, really careful with how I'm going around the snowman and the boundary circle so that I don't make a mess or have paint flooding everywhere. You want it to be wet, but you don't want puddles forming. I did an outline of the circle and along the base of the snowman in a concentrated form of the Payne's gray, and now I'm doing ultramarine blue and violet and really, really building up the saturation. So now that I've got a lot of color saturation, I want to add a little bit of texture to this background, and I'm going to do that by absorbing up some of the color with a dry paintbrush and just doing some dabbing motions. I use some paper towel to absorb some in the center, and then I dab some clear water onto the background and kind of let it dry. And you can see it kind of made this like swirly, frosty look, which I love. That pink tool that you saw me kind of hold over my paper, that is a heat gun, and it let me dry the paper really quickly so that I could start working on the snowman. And I'm just building up some shadows on his body using a light blue color. So it's just a mix of the blue that we have on our palette, and I've just diluted it out with a lot of water, and I'm just dabbing in some areas where I want there to be shadow on the snowman. And I am having the light come in from the right side, so more of the shadows are going to be on the left. But I wanted to touch back on that heat tool I used. You don't have to use one. I do really strongly recommend that you let your paper dry completely when you do a really wet background like that before you start working on other areas, because if it hasn't dried completely, that paint will flow into other areas that are wet, and that's where you get a lot of muddy mixing of colors and artwork ruined by watercolor. So let your layers dry completely. You can use a heat gun or a blow dryer to speed it up, or you can just let it dry on its own. Now I'm blocking in the colors for the cap and the scarf, and I'm just using red. I used cadmium red for the base layer, and then I mixed a little bit of our quinacridone red, our pinky red color, with some violet, and I'm going to use that for some of the shadow tones on the cap and scarf. And I'm not doing anything too complicated or difficult with these cards. I wanted to make them accessible and allow you guys to really feel confident in trying them out. But I'm just taking this darker color and adding it where I want some shadows to be. So I wanted it to be more on the left side of the cap. I'm adding some shadowed, or this dark violet where the scarf kind of folds over on itself, have it be on the left side of the scarf or of the left side of the body of the snowman, all of those types of things. And just by adding a few little things like that, you're going to build up a lot of dimension. I also did a little stripe detail with this kind of dark magenta violet color, just to help the snowman's scarf to have some texture so that it stands out from everything else. I did black for his coal eyes and buttons and mouth, and then I mixed a little bit of our gamboge with the cad red and used that to create his nose. Now I'm back to the gray blues, so some of the Payne's gray and our ultramarine blue, and I'm using that diluted down with a lot of water to build the shadows. Remember, with watercolor, you're not using white to make your colors lighter, you're using water. So if it's too dark, add more water to it. I think that's why I struggle with acrylics and oil paints. I'm so used to watercolor and looking at these pigments more purely with before the white gets added to it, that when I work in an opaque medium and I add white to the paint, it just looks wrong. It doesn't look right to me because it lost that luminosity and that transparency that I'm so used to with watercolor. But you can see the snowman is starting to take shape. I'm softening out some of those shadowed areas I did if I got some too dark, and absorbing them up with a clean paintbrush. Now I decided to darken up the background just a little bit more. You can very well leave it like this, like how we had it. But I wanted to do like some snowflakes and some things like that, and to make it look like the snowman was outside at night. And so I decided to do a glaze over the background and darken it up just a little bit. So I used the ultramarine blue and more Payne's gray, and I had it have a heavier mix of Payne's gray in it so that it read a little bit more black, and I did a layer of that on the background. I did absorb up a little bit in the center so we could keep some of that texture going on our snowman. But you can see it just helped the snowman to kind of pop out because there's a higher contrast of values between the background and the snowman. And this will allow the white of the snowflakes that we use the gel pen with to really stand out. So now I am going to be mixing up the color for the arms of the snowman, the little branches sticking out. And I used a mix of blue and burnt sienna. I believe I used the ultramarine blue, but there might have been a little phthalo blue in that mix. But I had it mostly be the brown color. I sketched in the branches, and I made sure they weren't identical because I want them to look different, like branches that you actually picked up off the ground. And by making them look a little different from each other, it looks more natural. Now you may have noticed that when we darkened the background of the snowman, it made the shadows that we did not seem strong enough. So I'm going back in and just doing a little bit more shadow work, some dark violets for the shadows on the cap and some navier blues for the shadows on the snowman. Then I let that dry completely, and then I started coming in and doing detail work with my gel pen. I'm creating a little bit of fur around the cap of, or the bottom of the hat, so it looks like a Santa hat, and the pom-pom on the edge. I did a little bit on top so it looks like some snow's gathering up on our snowman. On his head, I did some on the branches, like the branches are getting some snow stuck on them. And now I'm doing some random snowflakes and polka dots with the white gel pen in the background so that it looks like snow's falling to the ground. And I have to say, I think this was one of my favorite cards I did in this series. I just love this little snowman. I think he's so cute. So now it's time to get started on our forest. So I drew it earlier, like you saw. And now I'm carefully wetting the sky portion of this picture. And I'm being careful, again, going around the perimeter where the circle is. I'm not getting the moon wet because I want that to stay bright. And I am pulling some water down a little bit into where the trees will be because they're not going to be completely solid. And so some of that sky will peek through. And then I'm doing the same process that I did with the snowman. I'm adding some blues. This isn't going to be pure ultramarine blue this time because I picked up on this right after I finished the snowman, so there's a little bit of mixing going on. But mostly ultramarine blue went down as your base, and now I'm adding the Payne's gray around the outer perimeter for this kind of night sky scenario. And the nice thing about working wet into wet is it allows those paints to kind of flow and mix together on the paper, which I absolutely love. So now I have a blue-violet mixture that I've done that I'm kind of dabbing in, really encouraging some of that watercolor texture to show through. And then I took some clean water and I pulled some of that down into where the trees are going to be. Because it's going to be in a night setting, these trees aren't going to be bright or super vibrant. They're going to be dulled down because it's dark. And so by toning the paper, it's really helping me get that darker, more neutral tone. And it will allow the snow that we add on top with our white gel pen to really stand out. So I let that dry completely. Again, I'm still using my heat gun that I showed you earlier. It's just been edited out. And I let that dry, and now I'm doing another layer to build up kind of this dark value of the night sky. And that's something to keep in mind, is if your colors aren't dark enough, you can always let your paper dry completely and then do a glaze over the top. The only thing you don't want to do is add a ton of water with it. So you don't want to do a wet into wet wash on top of what you've already done. You more just want to add wet paint over dry paper, and that will allow you to layer it up. But I darkened it up, and now I want some texture in the sky similar to what we did with the snowman. So I added a little bit of water to it, and now I'm just dabbing it up. This is a technique that you can use to create interesting textures, especially when you're using granulating colors like ultramarine blue. But it's also a demonstration that if you don't want these little white highlights showing up on your picture, make sure you're careful with how much water you're adding, how much water you're leaving on your paper, and making sure you're absorbing any extra water like on the barrel of your brush when you rinse it out, so you don't get water dripping down onto your picture like that. Else it will do that same little highlight effect, and it's great when you want it, but it sucks when it happens where you don't want it. So I mixed some phthalo green and sap green together and some blue to start making our greens for our trees. And for these trees, I am just doing like little dabbing motions, kind of back and forth, little like squiggly lines. And I'm just making them be more narrow at the top and then have them gradually get wider as they go towards the base of the tree. So that kind of stereotypical triangular shape that you see with pine trees. And now I'm diluting this green tone out just a little bit because these smaller trees are going to be more in the distance, and so I want them to kind of recede. If I was to do this again, I would have neutralized that tone just a little bit and made them just a smidge lighter, and even done that with the two trees that are next to the middle one, because those are a little too similar in value. But I'll show you how I go about correcting that. But I'm just blocking in these trees and trying to get the shape that I want, like the mass of the trees to look like against the sky. So I've just been gradually building that up using our greens. Now, the trees don't really look like they belong on this background right now, and there's lots of gaps and things like that. So I'm going to start by filling in along the bottom of the trees and kind of darkening that up so it looks like there's like more overlap within the trees. I'm now going to let that dry and then come in with my gel pen, and I'm going to start doing some little lines and dashes and like little star shapes so that it looks like it's a night sky. And then we'll come back to the trees and tweak those up. So just little star effects, some bigger, some smaller, to look like there's depth within that sky. And then when I was done with the sky, I started in on the trees. And I'm just doing like little squiggly lines to indicate snow having fallen onto the branches. So I'm keeping it on the top side of each branch that I had done. And I'm varying up the marking so it doesn't look too symmetrical or the same. I'm also having those snow piles be a little bit thicker on the tree that's in the center because it's the closest one to us. And so it's going to be bigger in scale. And so now that I have all the snow kind of marked out on these trees, I am going to add some more shadow to really start bringing in that depth. And for this shadow, I'm going to be using just a blue color with just a little bit of green added to it so that it kind of goes with the trees. But I want that blue tone to really feel like a shadow, not like a branch, but that blue tone's really going to help it feel like the shadow or underside of the branches. So I'm just blocking those in, again, keeping my brush strokes very random. And I'm focusing right now more on this front tree, and then I'll start doing some of that to the trees that are more receded into the distance. But you can really see how we're already getting a lot more dimension and depth on this tree just by having your mid-tone be the green branches, highlights being that snow, and then having some darker colors to be the shadows. I then reinforce some of the shadow along the base of the trees because it's on the forest floor, and the light from the moon and the stars isn't going to be reaching the forest floor because it's blocked by trees, and so it's going to be a little bit darker. So I darken that up, and then I'm doing the same kind of shadow technique that I did on that first tree, and I'm doing it to some of the background trees. We are going to be tweaking and adjusting these in a minute so that those trees kind of recede visually, but I am starting to build up some of those values within it. I also added a little bit of a neutralized yellow color, so a little bit of yellow and violet mixed together to really help kind of like create a warm glow off of that moon so it wasn't pure white. When the trees dried, I added a few more highlights using the white gel pen, and then I kind of cleaned up some of the edges around the moon. Now, I had decided that those background trees were competing with that front tree just a little too much, and so I just took a clean, damp brush and kind of scrubbed it out just a little bit. By softening up those details, it really allowed that center tree to really stand out. So now I am sketching a smaller circle, and I'm not creating a perfect circle, and then I'm going to do a bigger circle around it. So kind of like a donut shape, but they're not perfectly round, just roughly round. And then I'm drawing two vertical lines coming from the top that connect to the top of the inner circle. And this is going to be the ribbon that our Christmas wreath is hanging from. And then I'm adding circles of various sizes. I'm doing kind of a bunch of bigger circles, and then I'm doing a group of smaller circles spread around. And those are going to be different colors of ornaments. And then I'm blocking in where some of the branches that I'm going to add to the wreath are going to be. Now I'm coming in with sap green, and I know this doesn't look exactly like sap green, and that's because I didn't rinse out my paintbrush very well, and there was red in it. So it kind of neutralized those more vibrant green tones at first. But I'm adding the sap green and creating kind of a wet layer of it all the way around our wreath. And I'm being careful going around all the little ornaments and the ribbon and not getting too much on the background, except for like right along the edges to create texture. But I'm just going around each of these little circles to create a base layer of sap green. And I'm working pretty fast for this because I want the paper to stay wet. So I'm even going back over some of these areas that I did at the beginning with some more sap green and just building this up and almost creating a wet into wet wash scenario. But my wet wash is toned green to start with. So now I'm taking our phthalo green, which is this really, really bright poison green color, and I mixed it with some of our cadmium red to help neutralize it just a little bit. And I added a little bit of ultramarine blue to darken it. And I'm starting to add that to the center of the wreath around the inner circle in dabbing motions to help create the texture of the branches on the trees while I'm building up these shadows, and not trees, wreaths. And then I'm going out and I'm doing the same thing on the outer circle of our wreath, but I'm making it just a little bit lighter. But by adding the shadow on the inner side and the outer ring of our wreath, it's really helping this wreath look rounded and dimensional. So, and giving it kind of a curve to it. But I'm just doing these dabbing marks, and then I'm spreading some of that green color into the center. I am having the light source come from like the top left side or the top right side of the picture. So I'm making the like top right side a little bit lighter than the bottom left. But I'm kind of doing these dabbing motions. I've mixed a little bit of sap green in with this to help neutralize it and kind of change up the colors. But I'm leaving little gaps of that original sap green color we did shining through this darker green, and that's going to create like a highlight effect. And I'm just taking my time, being careful about going around each of those ornaments because I don't want to get paint in them. Now I'm taking some more ultramarine blue and mixed with the green, but it's mostly blue, and I'm starting to add some more shadow. And I'm using a small paintbrush for this so I can vary up the size of my strokes, and I'm starting to dab that in a similar pattern to what we did with the green, the mid-tone green color we added. I'm just being careful not to cover up everything. When you're building in layers like this, you don't always want to cover up everything you just did, because I want those highlights of the light green to show through and the mid-tone to show through, so my shadowed sections aren't going to cover up everything. I then dried the wreath completely, and then I've started blocking in the red tones, and I'm starting with the cadmium red, so the more orangey red tones. You can see it's spilled all over my palette, so it's my go-to red right now, so I can use it up. But I just blocked in a base layer of it, and then I took a more concentrated version of it, so it has less water, and I started adding it to where some of those shadows on the ornament are going to be. So I kept it towards the bottom and had the shadow be on more of the left side of each little circle that we are filling in red. The other color is going to be yellow. And so we're going to create kind of a gold effect on our little tiny ornaments. And I'm using a neutralized yellow tone. So I took our gamboge and I added a little bit of violet to it, and I diluted it down to create this kind of neutralized yellow. It's not too neon. And I filled that in and let it dry. I had also added red to our wreath, and I did a base layer of that. And then I did a few line strokes to help start to build up the idea of there being folds and creases within that ribbon. I did another coat of red on all these. This is more of I took the quinacridone red, so our pink red, and added a little bit of violet to it to use it as more of a shadow tone. The reason why I mix the red with the violet is it helps it kind of blend in with the red and be a little bit more harmonious. So now I'm starting to build up some more of the shadows. So I mixed a little bit of our ultramarine blue and burnt sienna mix with our orange color, and I'm using that to create some more of the shadows on our gold ornaments. You don't want to use like lots of bright yellows with this, else it reads like neon yellow and not gold. But I added that to the bottom left side of each little ornament, and now I'm taking a dark green and I'm starting to create cast shadows underneath where each ornament is tucked in and nestled into the branches of our wreath, and that's going to really help these ornaments look like they are kind of nestled into it and sitting in it and part of it instead of just kind of floating in front of it. So I'm just going to darken up some areas on our ribbon that's holding the wreath up, and I pushed back my tape that was going all the way across my paper. I just kind of pushed that up so I could make the ribbon go all the way to the top, like it's extending from the top of the card. I used a higher concentration of red for that, and so very little water, and just flicked it upwards. Now I'm taking a dark brown. I think I might have used some Payne's gray and our burnt sienna for this mix, and I am just drawing in little branches that look like they've been tucked into the wreath, and we're going to draw little berries on it in white, so maybe like little mistletoe berries or something. We drew all those in, and now I'm just again refining some more of the details, taking our violet and creating more of a shadow towards the base of the ribbon where it kind of bunches together and wraps around our wreath. Now I'm drying it, and this is something I do a lot. I'll be like mixing a color and drying my paper at the same time. But I mixed a pale blue color, just very, very light, and I am creating a cast shadow of our wreath. and I didn't want it to be too distracting from the wreath, but I did want a little bit of dimension. So I took a pale blue, and I did some vertical brush strokes going down from the inside ring of the wreath and then the bottom of the outer ring, just so it looks like the light is coming in from the top side of it, and it really will help the wreath look a little bit more dimensional. Learning how to do shadows, even if they're really subtle, can make a big difference on what your end result will look like. So we did the little cast shadows. If you get it too dark or too much water or anything like that, don't be afraid to take your rag and kind of clean it up a bit. I then let it dry completely, and now I'm coming in and doing some more detail work using my white gel pen. And I'm doing little tiny highlights on each of the little ornaments. I'm making each highlight just a little different so it looks like the light is hitting and reflecting off of it on each unique ornament. So not like a cookie cutter pattern. And I'm adding little berries to the branches that we had painted in, adding some highlights to the ribbon so there's a little bit of a sheen on it, and just kind of fine tuning all of those little details. If I was going to be painting this, say on a larger scale, I wouldn't be using a gel pen. I would have kind of picked out where I knew some of those highlights would be and block them off using masking fluid. And then what I would have done is, after removing the masking fluid and working some more on the picture, if I needed to bring back some more highlights, I would have been using some kind of waterproof ink like the Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay Indie ink. That way I wouldn't have to worry about the ink being reactivated if water got over the top of it, and I could tone it down and tweak it as needed. But I'm just coming in and doing the last little bit of shadow work on this wreath and reinforcing some of the texture of the branches and shadows and all that kind of stuff. But here is the finished piece. This is probably my second favorite one behind the snowman that we did. So here is our ornament, and I started out by tracing the inside of our masking tape, and then I drew two rectangles or two lines going up the top of the circle, and then I drew a top on it and did a little scallop edge in the middle of it, and then I'm doing a little circle that connects to the top of that, which is going to be the loop that our ribbon goes through. So we drew the main body of the ornament, the little neck of it that comes up, and then the clasp and the ribbon. My video got deleted, and so I had to repaint this. And so after I drew it again, I wetted the whole ornament, and then I started doing a wet into wet wash. So I wet the whole thing, and then I came in with our gamboge in where I wanted the highlights to be, and now I'm coming in with our cadmium red, and I'm starting to block that in, and I'm doing this very wet, and I'm going to be doing most of this picture wet. This is probably the most technical of all the pictures. Even though it looks the most simple, it is the most technical because we're trying to create a smooth texture. I took a rag and I absorbed up some of the color where it was a little too dark because I wanted to preserve some of the white highlights where it's going to be the brightest. Now I'm coming in with our quinacridone red, so our cooler red tones, and starting to flood that into the picture and dabbing it in. I'm letting it dry where the highlights are so the paint's less likely to kind of blend into those sections. Now I'm taking our quinacridone red and violet, and I'm starting to dab in where I want some of those shadows and where I want it to be reflecting other objects in the room. I don't want to draw like this specific object is reflecting, but I'm going to do some little dark marks and details to make it look like something is being reflected on the shiny surface of this object and have it not look too cartoony or artificial. The violet and red mixture is really, really great for this. I am making sure that all my markings are kind of following the curves of our ornament. So I'm having some kind of curve upwards if they're closer towards the bottom, and if the markings are towards the top, I'm having them kind of curve downward. And this is going to help it have that rounded feel and make it look like all of our objects that are being reflected in it are being reflected accurately. because kind of round objects kind of bend the image around it. I'm also going to be doing some really dark shadows using ultramarine blue in this mix. Ultramarine blue plays really well with the reds we're using and the violet, and so I'm using that to help push some of those darker values within the object. Here you can see some of those, more of those like random dark markings that I did. Those are going to help indicate some of the shadows and reflections around the object. And the trick with this is just working wet into wet, and that's why it's so hard to even like explain what I'm doing, because I'm moving so fast to get it done while it's still wet. But you can see the markings, and then I let it dry completely, and you can see how it's kind of toned down in value as it's dried. And now I'm coming in with a gold color, so gamboge with a little bit of violet to neutralize it, and I'm blocking in the little cap part of our ornament that will hold the ribbon. I'm going to use a stronger concentration of violet and yellow together on the left hand side of this clasp or cap, so it can have a little bit more of a shadow detail. Then to play off the red, I'm using the opposite color, green, to be the ribbon for our ornament, and it's going to be a similar technique of what we did on the wreath, but this time it's going to be green. I did a sap green base, and now I'm coming in with a darker mix. This was just what was left on my palette from the wreath, and I'm just dabbing that in, particularly on the left hand side, and doing a few other dashes to help indicate that the ribbon's kind of folded and bended. But then I'm taking some of that green and I'm adding some of that to the cap of our ornament, and that's going to help it look like a reflective gold because it's being affected by the colors around it. I also used a little bit of green towards the top of our ornament where the shadow is going to be, and that's going to help indicate that the ornament itself is reflecting what's around it, like the ribbon that's holding it up. I then came in and did the last few really dark details with some violet and just added those towards the base on the right side and the top on the left side. So there it is, all finished, and all 4 of our cards together. I hope you found this video helpful and gave you some fun ideas if you wanted to paint Christmas cards or holiday themed paintings. If you like this video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more of what I create, please hit the subscribe button and notification bell. And I will see you next time.